Hi, friends. Welcome to the Mobile Bev Pros podcast, a podcast dedicated to providing mobile bar and event professionals with the information they need to succeed. I'm your host, business coach, and founder of the Mobile Bar Academy, Sarah Murphy. In each episode, the Mobile Bev Pros team will bring you industry experts, information, anecdotes, and opinions with the goal of assisting you in building a profitable, sustainable, and successful business that supports you in creating wealth. I'm excited to share with you today's episode, so let's get started. Today on the podcast, I'm here with Whitney Knox Lee, creator of the Imposter podcast. She's an anti-racism practitioner and attorney that specializes in training and workshopping. Today, she's here to chat with us about imposter experiences in entrepreneurship. Thank you for being with us today, Whitney.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. We talked a couple of months ago and my schedule has been crazy. So we're only just now doing this, but I've been looking forward to it.
Yeah, same. We did talk a couple months ago. I was very excited to talk about what we're talking about today. And also in that time, one of the reasons it was so crazy is that you have since become a full-time entrepreneur.
That's right. Yes. So I was a practicing civil rights attorney and the anti-racism stuff I did on the side. And I've decided that is the space that I want to be in full time. And so I am now working on getting all my ducks in a row and focusing on the podcast. So it's cool now. This is my first episode where I get to say that I'm an entrepreneur.
Yes, full-time founder
Mhm.
and creator. That's so exciting. And I'm personally always very invested in seeing people live their true purpose and their passion. And so congratulations on taking that leap. And you will know better than anyone else the impact of imposter syndrome on entrepreneurship. So can you talk a little bit about what imposter syndrome is, how it shows up, and the impacts that it can have?
Yeah. So imposter syndrome is this idea, a phenomenon where we feel as though we are intellectually a fraud. So maybe we are in new spaces or old spaces, but when we walk into those spaces, for whatever reason, we have an internal sense of self doubt. And it doesn't really matter that we have all of this experience behind us, or that we have the education behind us, or that we have the certifications behind us. Imposter syndrome makes it so that what we see or what we feel most is the self doubt in our capabilities to do the thing, whatever that is. And it's a relatively new term in that it's something that was studied in the late 1970s and was initially called the imposter phenomenon. And two psychiatrists here in Atlanta did this study of 150 high achieving, they called it, women. These women were primarily white and primarily middle to upper class. They were people in their PhD programs, they were respected professionals. Um, and they did this study because they were noticing that these people who were their clients were experiencing this self doubt, even though they were respected professionals, even though they were in these PhD programs. And so, what they determined, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, is that people with imposter syndrome experience it internally, that they attribute their success to luck instead of actual capability, that their failures are attributed to their actual lack of ability, and that the objective evidence to the contrary just does not matter. So, in other words, if I am successful because maybe I've earned my law degree, I will say, I just got lucky on my law school exams. But if I did poorly in a class or if I did not pass the bar exam, I would say that's just because I don't actually know what I'm doing. Around 25 to 30% of people, of high achieving people, experience imposter syndrome, and around 70% of adults experience it at least once in their lifetimes. And so when we're talking about like entrepreneurs, these are still these same numbers. And for me, as someone who's getting into entrepreneurship full time, I am absolutely saddled with imposter syndrome. And I think what I will distinguish a little bit here is that sometimes we just are new to something and we don't actually know. And that is different than knowing the things, but feeling like we don't. And so one of the things that I'm struggling with or balancing right now is just the acknowledgement that I'm going into business ownership, and that's new for me. And there are not things that I know, or excuse me, there are things that I do not know. But where it comes to the content and the lessons and the training and the putting together of these workshops and that type of thing, I know at least some of it. Like, I know it enough to be confident to put it together as a package for people. But when I'm feeling the self-doubt, like, that is the imposter syndrome there. So it's not the apprehension or the maybe low confidence or the anxiety that I feel just starting down this path. It's the other stuff.
That makes total sense. The thing that I see in myself when I know that I'm like tiptoeing into that imposter syndrome arena is this desire for more proof or more certifications or more degrees. I have 2 advanced business degrees, but somehow I feel like maybe if I take this course and I get this additional certification, I'll be more qualified to speak on this topic. The other way that I see it oftentimes show up in clients is this hesitancy to act. It shows up with this real, I don't know if there's just a ton of excuses or they keep it in the mental sphere where they have to problem solve extensively before they give themselves permission to actually move forward, which obviously is going to stunt business growth.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So that's one of the what's her name? Dr. Valerie Brown came up with 5 types of imposter syndrome. And to me, it sounds like you're talking about the perfectionism, which is something that I absolutely experience when I started my podcast, Imposter X Podcast. I created one episode that was all about my anxiety because what had happened was I'm somebody that has anxiety disorder and depression. And it was like this wave of different events that were happening in my life coupled with this podcast and needing it to be perfect that I was up until 3 a.m. in the morning re-editing an episode that I had already edited, driving myself crazy. I started having physical manifestations of anxiety. So I started itching like uncontrollably. And there was some mental health stuff going on, but it was also this perfectionism that I couldn't get past. And when I'm living in my anxiety, the perfectionism gets even worse. And so we call it in podcasting this analysis paralysis of there's so much information that we can take in. And we are trying to produce the best product, the best service. And when we're doing that, sometimes the process itself is serving as a barrier to just doing the thing. And so certainly for folks who are perfectionists and experience this, one thing, one reframe that I like to use for myself is that perfection is relative. And I was recently told about a book that I have not yet read, but that I will, called The Good Enough Job, I think is what it's called. And my understanding is that it's just helping us learn about when what we've done is enough, is good enough for what our goal is. And for me, some things do need to be perfect, I think, but not everything. There's probably like a very small category of things that I need to realistically shoot for perfection. Everything else, it's like, am I proud of it? Am I proud of this product? Am I proud of this service? Am I proud of this worksheet that I created? Is that has to be my guiding light, I think, moving forward. Otherwise, I'm never going to do anything. Like nothing is going to be done. And for the sake of my mental health, for the sake of my clients, for the sake of the people that I'm collaborating and conspiring with, there needs to be a finish line. We need to finish things. It can't just be that we're working on this endlessly and internally, and nobody's going to pay for that. I'm not going to pay for that.
I love this reframe because I think there is for everybody a point in which we have to recognize that the process will teach us as we go. And your highlight there of a worksheet really resonates with me because one of the things that I provide for my community, I think they appreciate the most, are the tools that I build. And the reality is that the tools are never finished.
And I could spend an entire year creating a thing, and then I'm going to put it out into the world and people are going to have feedback on it. And so I've learned that if I can just get it out there sooner, I can get that feedback sooner. The process goes a little bit faster and it becomes a better tool in a shorter amount of time. My ability to do that really came from working on my willingness to fail and to be vulnerable, because I think I'm going to speak for myself here. I can't speak for everybody, but I do think there was a lot of messaging to myself growing up that failure was bad. And by being the smartest person in the world, the person with the most authority, then you don't get questioned. And you didn't want to be questioned. That was if people are questioning your authority, you're doing it wrong. And that was a real challenging reframe for me to realize that there was actual real value in the vulnerability, and even more value in learning how to fail as a part of the process.
Yeah, I think you're right. And what I initially thought of for people that are just listening and not watching, I am a Black woman, identify as a Black American woman. And in our community, this idea of failure is even more just unacceptable. And it's the reason why it's unacceptable is because it can be so much harder for us to find success, to navigate systems, to do whatever it is that we want to do because of the historic racism in this country. And a lot of in our families, we grow up learning that we need to work twice as hard to get to the same distance, to reach the same goal, that we need to be absolutely perfect in every aspect of our lives, that we need to code switch, which is this idea of when we show up in a quote professional space, we need to take on the mannerisms and the language of white dominance and leave our cultural selves behind in order to be successful. And that if we are not able to do some of these things, then that means we are not going to be able to find relative success. And so, with that being said, I think one of the other kind of concepts that I want to transition us into is this idea of imposter experiences. Because I think at the outset, I said there's a difference between just having inexperience and being nervous or anxious or whatever, and then of being experienced, but experiencing self-doubt also. And so there's this third kind of category that a lot of us folks of color live in, which is feeling confident, having the experience, but entering a space that just wasn't made for us. And that can mean as entrepreneurs, that can mean that we find ourselves providing a service or physically being in a space that is not used to seeing people that look like us or that speak with our intonation or that dress like we do or that eat the foods that we eat. But that can also mean that, like, within our professional careers, the systems that are in place was not built to support or to celebrate us. So again, I'm coming from a legal background. Primarily, I've been a practicing attorney for 10 years, and the law is a very white institution. And one example that I have of like being in a physical space where there was a sense of non belonging is walking into courtrooms. When we walk into a courtroom, you look around, there's images, there's pictures, portraits of all of the judges or the justices, if you're in like the Supreme Court or wherever. None of them are Black until recent history. If you're in like the United States Supreme Court, you'll see a couple Black, you'll see Thurgood Marshall. But for most of us, particularly when we're in small towns or in cities, we walk in and we see walls of white faces. And this can be the same. Another example that I have is working in I guess, an exhibit, a conference. There we go. Being at a conference, having an exhibit table, because maybe you're tabling and telling people about your business or whatever. But in that physical space, you're not seeing any other people of color, or you're not seeing any other women, or you're not seeing anybody else with visual disabilities. And being in that experience, being in that environment where you feel alone and you don't feel like you belong can create in you a feeling of imposterism, a feeling of, I don't belong here. I don't deserve to be here. I'm a fake or I'm a fraud because I don't have the background that these folks have, or I don't have the skin color that these folks have. And so I think it's really important for us as we navigate entrepreneurial and business professional spaces to be open minded about what that means, or even just acknowledge that we all have our own perception of what it means to be an entrepreneur, of what it means to be a consultant, of what it means to be a business owner, of what it means to be successful, of how we should be showing up to events, of what professionalism looks like. And that the baseline for many of us of this perception of what these things should look like is a baseline based on white culture and not on the culture of anybody else. Not on Native American culture, not on Black culture, not on Hispanic culture, just white culture. So when we have people that we're working with or other business owners who are coming from other cultures and even other white people, Europeans coming from other cultures, what our ideas about professionalism might be different. So somebody coming from an African country, for them wearing colorful, large clothing, flowing skirts, head wraps, and all of that might mean something completely different than it does for somebody from an American background. So I think for me, I've had enough of these experiences of showing up to conferences and feeling like, "Ugh, this does not feel comfortable. This does not feel safe. I don't feel like I belong." That now I'm very purposeful about when I'm going to professional events and spaces because I don't want to feel that way. I can't show up fully if I'm feeling that way. I can't even pay attention if I'm feeling that way because I'm concerned about how I'm being perceived, if I'm being perceived as a threat, if I'm being perceived as like I don't belong, like I'm not smart, like I don't have the expertise.
100%. We have a very diverse community in the mobile bar industry, and that is like race, financial background, and this idea or concept that a lot of these kind of baselines are established in white culture, and I would even say elite white culture.
Yes.
We have a number of people in the community I've spoken to who maybe they don't have a college education, maybe they didn't even finish high school, but they're great behind the bar and they want to get into entrepreneurship, but there's just barrier after barrier. And the research I've done into this, some of it is hidden. The barrier could be something
Yeah.
like language. And you touched on this a little bit as well. But when you go to the city and you try and figure out what the licensing requirements are, if how that information is communicated, documented, and presented is more than 2 levels above your ability to understand that, it is unachievable for you to comprehend it. It is therefore out of reach for you to digest that information. And we do a very poor job, in my opinion, with government and supporting entrepreneurs getting into business that bridges that gap of bringing it down to the level reading wise, language wise,
Mhm.
for people to actually be able to process and implement that information, which leads to people out there running businesses illegally, unprofessionally. I say those with air quotes because I feel like people are showing up as professionally as they are capable of, that they have access to, and that aligns with their values. So to your point, like professional is all perspective. And it's a real barrier to those that are in an industry like ours, wherein the most profit margins, the most amount of money, and the most amount of success are found in the luxury space.
Mhm.
And the luxury space is dominated by white wealth.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you mentioned it because I can get really focused on race and culture and not class or patriarchy. And I think class is so important, specifically with this group of people, with mobile bar owners, for the reasons that you said. And when we are working, when we are mentoring or being mentored, or if we are collaborating with others, it's so important that we keep in mind that we are all coming with a variety of experiences to the working space, and a variety of education levels and literacy levels. You were talking about people being able to navigate the application process, and I'm like, I got degrees, and I, I don't know, it's not easy. It wasn't made to be easy. It wasn't made to be accessible. But in this industry where there's a low barrier to entry primarily, I can see that there would be a lot of like conflict between what mobile bar owners actually know and experience and have experience doing versus what state or government entities are requiring of them.
Yeah. I think I mentioned to you that my husband's an attorney as well, and he got his law degree just fairly recently. So he was an adult professional when he got his law degree. And I have hoisted all of my business related stuff on him because despite having 2 advanced business degrees, I can't figure it out sometimes. I keep getting these notifications from the state of North Carolina. I have one of my employees is in North Carolina, and I've done all the things, but they just keep sending me stuff. And he spent, and I'm not kidding, 4 hours on hold and on the phone with North Carolina. And like, if I was paying for his billable time to do this, to your
Mhm.
point, it's not easy to navigate, and it's not meant to be easy to navigate. If it was, this wouldn't be so hard. And
Mhm.
so there's just barrier after barrier that's put in front of people unless they have the resources or the connections or just the boldness to say, I'm going to do it anyways, whether or not I'm checking all the proper boxes. And that's a terrible place to be. It is this, well, fuck it, we'll figure it
Mhm.
out. Well,
Yeah.
what are the other options? And so I give so much credit to the people that are out there that recognize they have no idea what they're doing, but they're doing it anyways. And they're figuring out as they go. I've talked to some now multi-million dollar entrepreneurs in the mobile bar space who will literally tell me, I was winging it and I didn't have any of the proper things to do it in the beginning. And it wasn't until I became big enough to actually have some money would anybody help me. And so I encourage a sloppy start in a system that's not meant to support you otherwise.
Yeah, and I'll say some of us are experiencing imposter syndrome because we can't figure it out. Like some of us, the internal message that we tell ourselves when we are trying to figure out things like licensing or registering the business or whatever it might be, and it's not computing in our brains don't think this way. Some of us tell ourselves that we're imposters, that we're frauds, that we don't belong here. And I think the overall message that folks should get from this conversation, at least as part of this conversation, is that we are not. It's just hard and confusing. That's where it ends. That's where the sentence ends. It's just hard and confusing, and we're just trying to figure it out. It's not that we don't belong, and we will figure it out. We will continue.
Yes. I also want to pivot this conversation to the single word. I've been doing an inordinate amount of reading and research, deep diving on this concept, both psychologically, sociologically, and otherwise. And that is the concept of safety.
Mm.
And I'm going to start this portion of the conversation with a story that I already shared with you, but I think it's extremely relevant to this industry. And for those who don't know me, I'm not only white, I grew up in a very rural area that didn't have a diverse population. It wasn't until I moved to DC back in 2007 that I ever lived in an area that I lived in Venezuela for a year and I was the minority in that case, but I don't think that's the same. And so I am learning a lot of things about experiences and how they change based on the perspective of race and the other patriarchy and that sort of thing later in life. But we were doing a site tour with a prior business partner of mine, and she's an African American woman. And we were at a country club and we were hosting an event. and we were trying to find a good venue. She pulls up, she gets out of the car, I meet her, and she looks at me and she's like, Sarah, she's like, people like me don't belong here. And I just brushed it off. And I said like some offhanded comment. I'm like, our money's as good as theirs. So you do now. But afterwards, I sat with that. And I realized at that point, like I had no ability to understand how it must have felt to be in a country club in the South, nonetheless, which, with the terrible history of not only not belonging, but being actively removed from spaces. And the more I think and the more I sit with that experience, the more I reflect on how many Black entrepreneurs in the South is probably highlighted as being probably extra contentious, are trying to start their mobile bar businesses and gain a foothold while having to show up at places like plantations and in spaces that were not welcoming to their ancestors and may not even be welcoming to them now, and the impact it has on their willingness to show up, their willingness to be big, their willingness to market, their willingness to be competitive. And I don't know if you have any insight or things that you want to mention there, or even like you gave some reframe opportunities, encouragement. But I think this is a very real topic and one that I didn't have a whole lot of awareness around. And I think needs to be thought of not only by Black entrepreneurs or diverse entrepreneurs, but by white entrepreneurs who hire diverse staff and then ask them to go into these spaces.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you bring this up. I've had these experiences where, similar to your colleague, of just like almost dread pulling up, like you're going to an event space, and I go because I'm a guest normally, but I'm pulling up to the event space and I'm just like, my heart sinks when I see that it is a plantation, like plantation is in the name, or it is a country club, which means plantation. Some of this code language is not code for folks who are marginalized. And it's difficult to navigate for some and sometimes. I think the really important thing to say here is that we don't all experience these things the same. And so there might be parts of the country where maybe I just don't know the history there. So I'm completely oblivious to whatever it is. Or I also sometimes feel like physical, like I've been trying to listen to my body more and become like a vibes person more. And I'm noticing that sometimes the vibes just don't feel right. And I might not have the language to explain why. I don't know the history of the space. I don't know why. All I know is that it feels weird. It feels eerie. It feels unsafe. I'll also note that for Indigenous people here in the United States, I don't know how they go anywhere without feeling like this space isn't safe because they were exterminated. They were just completely exterminated from the land that I live on here in Atlanta, Georgia. And then we talk about LGBTQ, queer folks and trans folks, and in some of these states where the policies, the laws exclude them or are harmful. And so I think what's important is that when we're working with whoever we're working with, we can just be working with a white colleague, like another Sarah Murphy. We can be having conversations about where we're going, who we are contracting with to provide this service, what this physical space looks like, and whether or not we feel safe, and how we can support one another through that. And so that might mean that if I'm working with somebody, or maybe I'm the business owner and I have decided to offer shifts to specific people. So it may look like me as the business owner saying, okay, this is where this event is. This is the part of town that it's in. I don't know anything about the history. I wanted to offer this shift to you. Or do you feel safe or comfortable working there? And do you want this shift? Because also, the question of do you want the shift and the question of do you feel safe is going to be a very different question with a very different answer. Do I want the shift? Yeah, I want to go make some money. Do I feel safe? No, I don't feel safe, but I need to make some money. So I need to put my safety on the side burner. So we need to be having conversations about how we can support one another when we're going into these spaces. Does this person need to leave early because maybe they don't feel safe after a certain time? Does the person want to work with other people that they're more comfortable with? So with a friend who they might feel more comfortable leaning on instead of a random person that they don't have a lot of experience working with. I would also suggest that we start to really vet where we're doing our business. And if our company does not already have values that are outside of the traditional business values, that we start to establish those. I think it's important where we decide to spend our money, but also where we decide to earn money. And so if it's a place that, we don't agree with their politics or we don't agree with their values or whatever the case may be, I think it's okay for us to make that decision and to express why we are making that decision, acknowledging that there's some risk involved with that in terms of the reputation of our business. But I do think that increasingly in this world, it matters how we support marginalized communities, and it matters when we're staying silent to things. And consumers wanna know what it is that you care about, and then they wanna see it in action.
All of these suggestions were absolutely perfection. I am a big believer in establishing your business values. I think the last podcast is actually about establishing business values and then living your values. So this is perfect on the heels of that. But sometimes that looks like saying no to money. And potentially that's the biggest and best way that you can demonstrate your values. I know for me personally, I'm in Tennessee and everything about the state violates my values, mainly because I have a uterus, but also in the fact that I just feel like we have people that are actively working against the interests of humanity, of people
Mhm.
as people, whether it's the trans ban, whether it's the abortion ban, whether it's making the Christian Bible the state book, which is like an absolute ridiculous thing to spend their dollars on, but we do it every session and it's ridiculous. I have had Bill Lee and Marsha Blackburn try and hire my bar company for political campaigns and fundraisers, and it's an emphatic no every time. But when it comes to values and safety, they are interrelated. People who see that you share their values will inherently feel safer with you and around you, and vice versa. If your values violate the values of someone else, they will feel less safe around you. And that's doing them a service. If you can make it easy for people to understand who they're safe around and who they're not safe around, the world will feel safer.
Right.
Everybody individually will feel safer.
Yeah, and one thing that just came up to me, it takes extra labor for people of color to be in spaces that are unsafe for them. It takes more emotional labor, and not just people of color. So also queer folks, disabled folks. When you're in a space that doesn't feel safe and that in fact may not be safe, most of the time it just may not be safe. It takes extra labor for you just to show up and do your job. And so I'd also encourage people to find creative ways to compensate people for that extra labor. In my field, we talk about equity as instead of equality. So equality is treating everyone the same. Color blindness or color evasiveness is the underlying value with equality, meaning that we're not really acknowledging how people's lived experiences are different because of their race. What I push is for equity, and that is fairness. It's being fair to people based on what their experience is because of their race, because of their disability, because of their whatever it may be. And so for me, thinking about equitable pay means thinking about the extra labor that certain groups of people are needing to expend when you're holding a specific event at a specific place. or when you're in a place that's going to take more labor for a particular person. And that doesn't have to be money. It can be, but it can also, you can be creative with how you compensate people. But I do encourage people to think about what that can look like. Because also, I think this is a way to keep people working for you. Because the fact of the matter is, not all of our businesses are we able to say no to dollars, especially if you're a new business. Like, you may be in a situation where you just don't feel like that's reasonable, or not reasonable, but doable. Also, not all of our businesses are able to work in spaces that are always going to feel safe for everybody 100% of the time. If you're a business in the South, probably a big part of your like wedding funds, your wedding business comes from weddings that are on plantations. And so if you said no to that money, that's half your business. And so acknowledging that and recognizing that, what can you do to make the space feel safer or to make the person feel supported so that you can continue to hire people from all different backgrounds, but then also to compensate them?
I love the concept there of payment and it not necessarily having to be money. Like maybe it's like the next day off. Maybe it's that they get to work with their friend to help support them at that shift. You had mentioned that you're starting to listen to your body. Your nervous system will tell you through bodily sensations and emotions when you're feeling unsafe. Or nervous or fear or any of those things. It's the same thing, right? You're not in a regulated state. And there are a few things that we know help to regulate someone's nervous system, and co-regulation is one of those things. And that's being with someone that you feel safe with and sharing your experiences, or taking more time off where you're not in those unsafe situations so that your nervous system can regulate itself again. So I love that you pointed that out. If you're going to ask people to tax themselves or put themselves in a place that feels unsafe, it's also a good idea to provide them opportunities to recover or
Mhm.
compensate for that taxation.
Yeah.
Whitney, as someone who specializes in not only anti-racism, but also imposter syndrome and is now a full-time entrepreneur yourself, what are the top 3 things that you're bringing into your new business, both to mitigate being held back by imposter syndrome, but also to create a safe space for future employees, for people that you're going to work with and partner with, so that you are able to embody and live the values and the expertise that you've created up until this point?
Wow, that's a great question. First would be grace. I am someone that does not offer myself a lot of grace, but I will offer it to other people readily. And one of the practices that I've had over the past year, as I've been navigating some tumultuous professional situations, is the practice of allowing myself the kind of grace that I would give others. So for me, what that means is if I make a mistake, acknowledging the mistake, figuring out how I can learn from it and moving on instead of ruminating on it or like beating myself up about it. So that's one of them. The second is curiosity, because like I said at the outset, I'm in this place of, yes, I have imposter syndrome about the content, but I also am just inexperienced in creating a business. So what that means for me is that I'm going to need to spend probably most of my time at the outset just figuring out how to create a business, figuring out like the nuts and bolts and the logistics behind having a business and offering a service and putting together a product, a tangible product that people who access the service can use as tools. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is that I really want to work in community and in collaboration with others. I'm a firm believer in I don't participatory change. So what I mean by that is I don't really want to be in competition with other anti-racism service providers. I want to be working with them with the trust that we have shared goals for how our communities, how our workplaces, how our neighborhoods, how our governments can move forward. And it's different from being a mobile bar owner. But I think as I start out this business, I don't want to start out with this idea of it's either me or them, of this like very deeply steeped capitalist ideology. And I think what that's going to mean is working a lot with other service providers, with other trainers to create programming, to create workshops, to create courses that are bigger than me and bigger than my name, bigger than my own individual philosophy, but instead that bring communities together. And I don't know how that's going to be money making. I don't know if that's going to be a sustainable business plan. Maybe, but I'm willing to see, because the other thing that I know about myself is that I am employable. If this doesn't work, I'll go back to practicing law. It's okay. Like, it'll be fine. And so really just putting faith in myself as much as possible right now and in the ideas that I have, knowing that my fallback will be I'll go charge people a shit ton of money to do a little bit of work as a lawyer.
Whitney, this has been an absolute joy, and I have gotten a ton out of our conversation, as I always do. If you are listening and you have loved listening to Whitney as much as I have, please go search out her podcast, hit up her website, reach out to her, let her know how much you appreciated her being on the podcast and sharing her immense amount of information and expertise with us. And we wish you all the very best of luck in entrepreneurship, Whitney.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to this space. It's been really cool because it's a different group of folks that I would usually be engaging with around this work. And I love that y'all are wanting to have these conversations because I think it's so important for all of us to be moving in the same direction around equity and safety and anti-racism. So thank you so much.
Amazing.
And that wraps up today's episode. I hope it was valuable. I would love to hear from you what you thought. You can drop me a line at hello@mobilebevpros.com or find me on Instagram at mobilebevpros. If you're looking for more valuable mobile bar related content, we have a website full of it. You can find us at www.mobilebevpros.com. And I'd love to see you in our Facebook community, also by the name of, you guessed it, Mobile Bev Pros. Thank you for joining me today, and until next time, cheers.